I would rather die than be captured by Americans. These were the exact words of Captain Mitsuyo Nakamura, moments before his plane was shot down over the Pacific in 1944. He had been told Americans collected Japanese ears as trophies, that they pulled out prisoners' teeth one by one while filming, that they starved Asian captives until they resorted to cannibalism. For 3 days after his capture, Captain Nakamura refused to eat, waiting for the torture to begin. Then on the fourth day, something happened that would haunt him for the rest of his life. An American guard handed him a hamburger, French fries, and something called Coca-Cola. The moment this Japanese pilot, who had killed Americans, who had trained to die for his emperor, took his first bite, he broke down sobbing. Not from pain, not from fear, but because in that single moment, everything he believed about America crumbled. It was more than food, he later wrote. It was the moment I realized my government had lied to me about everything. Hey there, welcome back to Untold Ww2 stories. I'm so grateful you've joined me today, especially my loyal subscribers who show up for every video. You guys are the reason I keep digging for these forgotten stories that changed history. Before we dive in, I just want to say a quick prayer for all of you watching. May your day be filled with moments of discovery and wonder. May you find strength when you need it most, and may your lives be touched by unexpected kindness, just like the story I'm about to share. Amen. Kindly tell us in the comment where you are watching from. Now, let me tell you about America's most powerful and unexpected weapon in the Pacific War. Not bombs, not battleships, hamburgers, and Coca-Cola. This is the classified story of how America's most ordinary meal accomplished what torture never could, and how it helped transform Japan from our deadliest enemy into one of our strongest allies. By the end of this video, I promise you'll never look at fast food the same way again. The trucks bumped along the dusty road, each jolt sending pain through the bodies of the Japanese prisoners. Many hadn't slept in days, some hadn't eaten in longer. Their uniforms, once symbols of imperial pride, now hung in tatters on their thin frames. Wounds from battle had barely scabbed over. Eyes that once blazed with determination now stared blankly, preparing for what they believed would be their final destination. Sergeant Toshiro Yamada leaned against the truck wall, his ribs visible through his skin, his cheeks hollow from months of poor rations. Next to him, a young pilot named Kenji couldn't stop shaking. "Stop trembling," Toshiro whispered. "Die with dignity." "I'm trying," Kenji answered, his voice breaking. But the stories, the things that Americans do to prisoners, every man in that truck had heard the same warnings. American soldiers collected body parts as souvenirs. They starved Asian prisoners while eating feast in front of them. They performed medical experiments without anesthesia. These weren't just rumors, these were official warnings from their superiors, taught as fact in their military training. As the trucks slowed, the men grew silent. This was it. The end. The back flaps of the truck opened. Bright sunlight poured in, momentarily blinding the prisoners. American guards stood waiting, rifles in hand. "Out! Everyone out!" they shouted through interpreters. The Japanese soldiers stumbled from the trucks, some barely able to stand. They squinted in the harsh light, expecting to see torture devices, execution grounds, or cages. Instead, what they saw made them freeze in confusion. Before them stood rows of wooden barracks, neatly arranged. The grounds were clean. American flags fluttered in the breeze. It looked ordinary, organized, nothing like the nightmarish prison they had imagined. "Keep moving," the guards ordered, directing them toward a processing building. Lieutenant Hideki Takahashi, once a decorated officer in the Emperor's Navy, leaned close to Captain Watanabe. "This must be where they prepare us," he whispered. "They'll clean us before the experiments." Captain Watanabe nodded grimly. Americans like their victims clean. The prisoners shuffled forward in a line, passing an area where other Japanese POWs, men who had arrived earlier, were hanging laundry on lines. They looked thin but not starving. They wore clean clothes with PW stamped on the back. None were missing limbs. None showed signs of torture. "Are those really our men?" a soldier whispered. "Or Americans dressed to trick us?" "Look at their eyes," another answered. "Those are Japanese. But why do they look normal?" As they approached the processing building, something else caught their attention. People in civilian clothes stood watching. clipboards in hand. They wore armbands with red crosses. "Who are they?" Kenji asked. "Red Cross," Toshiro answered, his brow furrowed in confusion. "International observers." This made no sense. Why would Americans allow outsiders to witness their treatment of prisoners? Unless... "It's all for show," Captain Watanabe hissed. "They'll remove the observers once they've seen what they want them to see." Inside the processing building, the confusion only grew. American medics checked their wounds. They were given soap and directed to showers with actual hot water. Their infested uniforms were taken away to be burned, and they were issued new clothing. A young private named Ichiro emerged from the shower, trembling, not from cold, but from fear. He was certain the water would turn to gas at any moment. When it didn't, when he was simply given a towel and clean clothes, he stood paralyzed with confusion. "Why are they treating us this way?" he asked an older soldier. "Is this some kind of trick?" The older man shook his head slowly. "Perhaps they fatten us first, or perhaps they need us healthy for their experiments." That night, in their assigned barracks, clean buildings with actual beds, blankets, and heating stoves, the men huddled together, voices low, trying to make sense of what they had seen. "My cousin fought in China," one soldier said. "He told me Japanese camps for Chinese prisoners had no beds, no medicine. Men died by the hundreds every week." "That's different," another argued. "The Chinese are our enemies." "And we are America's enemies," Captain Watanabe reminded them. "Do not be fooled by this theater they have created." Lieutenant Takahashi sat on his bunk, running his fingers over the wool blanket, thicker and warmer than anything he'd had even as an officer in the Imperial Navy. "I don't understand," he said softly. "Why would they waste resources on men who are going to die?" Kenji, the young pilot, stared out the window at the camp. Guards patrolled the fences, but they weren't beating anyone. No screams echoed across the grounds. No smoke rose from cremation pits. "Maybe," he started, then stopped, afraid to voice his thought. "Speak," Toshiro encouraged. "Maybe they aren't going to kill us." The barracks fell silent. The idea was too dangerous, too unexpected to consider. Hope was more painful than certainty. "Of course they will," Captain Watanabe said firmly. "This is just their way. Americans are strange. They clean their cattle before slaughter, too." But as night fell over the camp, as the men lay on real mattresses for the first time in months, doubt crept into even the most certain minds. The treatment they had received contradicted everything they had been told about Americans. "Tomorrow," Lieutenant Takahashi whispered in the darkness, "tomorrow we will see their true nature." But deep down, a terrifying question was forming in his mind, one more frightening than the prospect of torture or death. What if everything we were taught about Americans was a lie? The first morning in camp began with a sharp whistle blast at 6 a.m. The Japanese prisoners jolted awake, many reaching instinctively for weapons that were no longer there. Outside, American guards walked between the barracks, some carrying rifles, others simply checking that everyone was up. "Line up outside, formation in 5 minutes," they called through interpreters. In their barracks, Captain Watanabe quickly gathered the men. "Remember your training," he whispered urgently. "Give only your name, rank, and number. Nothing more. This is when it starts." The men nodded grimly. They had been taught what to expect on the first full day of captivity. Beatings to establish dominance, starvation to weaken resistance, perhaps selecting the weakest for examples. Every man steeled himself for what was to come. They filed outside into the cold morning air, standing at attention as they'd been trained. An American sergeant walked down the line, studying them. The prisoners held their breath, waiting for the first blow to fall. Instead, the sergeant simply nodded and spoke to an interpreter. "Tell them breakfast is in 20 minutes. After that, medical checks for everyone." The interpreter translated, and confusion rippled through the Japanese ranks. Breakfast? More medical checks? Where was the punishment? As they marched to the mess hall, Lieutenant Takahashi noticed something odd about the American guards. They seemed relaxed. They talked and sometimes even laughed among themselves. They didn't scream constantly or strike prisoners who walked too slowly. One even helped an elderly prisoner who stumbled on the path. "It's because the Red Cross is still here," Captain Watanabe insisted when Takahashi mentioned this. Once they leave, you'll see the true American nature. In the mess hall, the prisoners receive trays of hot oatmeal, bread with butter, and coffee. The portions were larger than most had seen in months of fighting. Some couldn't believe it was all for them. "Is this really our food?" a young soldier named Hiroki asked a guard, pointing at his tray. The American guard, a freckled boy who looked no older than 19, nodded. "Yeah, that's yours. Eat up, buddy." Hiroki didn't understand all the words, but the nod and gesture were clear enough. He looked down at his tray again, still suspicious. "Poison?" he asked quietly. The guard's eyes widened, then he laughed and shook his head. "No poison. Same food I eat. Look." He picked up a spare piece of bread from Hiroki's tray, took a bite, chewed, and swallowed. "See? No poison." Hiroki watched in amazement as the guard walked away, continuing his rounds. Why would an American guard eat a prisoner's food to prove it wasn't poisoned? It made no sense. After breakfast came the medical examinations. This, the prisoners were certain, was when the true horror would begin. Stories of Japanese doctors who performed experiments on Chinese prisoners flashed through their minds. Would Americans do the same to them? Private Matsuda had a badly infected wound on his leg from shrapnel. He'd hidden it as best he could, fearing that injured prisoners would be the first to be disposed of. But in the medical tent, an American doctor discovered it during his examination. "This is serious," the doctor said, frowning at the red, swollen flesh. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" The interpreter translated, and Matsuda lowered his eyes, certain his fate was sealed. "Tell him we need to clean this properly and give him penicillin." The doctor continued. "Otherwise, he could lose the leg." When the interpreter explained this, Matsuda looked up in shock. "You will heal me?" he asked through the interpreter. The American doctor seemed puzzled by the question. "Of course. That's my job." Within an hour, Matsuda's wound had been thoroughly cleaned, treated with medicine he'd never seen before, and properly bandaged. The doctor had even given him extra pills to take for pain. Back in the barracks, the prisoners gathered to share their experiences. "The doctor gave me medicine for my stomach," one man said, showing small white tablets. "Real medicine, not just water or salt." "A guard helped me read a form," another added. "He didn't hit me when I couldn't understand." Sergeant Toshiro remained skeptical. "My brother was captured by the Japanese army in Manchuria. They pulled out his fingernails one by one. This must be some American trick." "But why waste medicine on men they plan to torture?" asked Kenji, the young pilot. "It makes no sense." As the days passed, the prisoners watched the guards carefully, waiting for the mask to drop. They noticed things that confused them deeply. The guards worked in shifts, professional but not cruel. They didn't seem to enjoy their power over prisoners. When a Japanese soldier named Tanaka collapsed during exercise, guards didn't kick him or leave him to suffer. They carried him to the medical tent. Most confusing of all were the casual interactions. A guard teaching a prisoner how to play an American card game during a break. Another showing photos of his family back home. One even attempting to learn basic Japanese phrases, laughing good-naturedly when he mispronounced words. Captain Watanabe watched all this with growing unease. After a week, he gathered his most trusted men in a corner of the barracks. "This is psychological warfare," he insisted. "They're trying to confuse us, make us lower our guard. The real Americans will show themselves eventually." But Private Ichiro, who had been so terrified on arrival, had a different theory. "What if," he said hesitantly, "what if our commanders were wrong about Americans?" Captain Watanabe's face hardened. "That's exactly what they want you to think. Remember your training. Remember your loyalty to the Emperor." Yet, even as he said this, doubt flickered in his eyes. He had seen an American guard share his cigarettes with prisoners. He had witnessed medical care given freely to men who, in Japanese hands, would have been left to die. He had heard guards talking among themselves, unaware he understood bits of English from school. These poor bastards are half-starved. Yeah, makes you wonder what kind of army doesn't feed its own men. That night, as rain pattered against the barracks roof, Lieutenant Takahashi approached Captain Watanabe. "Sir," he said quietly, "what if this isn't a trick?" Watanabe stared at him for a long moment. "If it's not a trick," he finally replied, then everything we were taught about Americans was a lie. And if they lied about this, he didn't finish the sentence. Both men knew what hung in the balance. If the Americans weren't the monsters they'd been told, what else had their leaders lied about? The question was too dangerous to consider. And yet, with each passing day of unexpectedly humane treatment, it became harder to ignore. 2 weeks after arriving at the camp, the Japanese prisoners were gathered in the main assembly hall. Many still flinched when guards approached. Some still refused to look Americans in the eye, fearing that any sign of defiance would bring swift punishment. An older American officer entered, accompanied by a man in a suit wearing a Red Cross armband. The prisoners stood at attention, as they'd been taught. At ease, the officer said through an interpreter, "Please sit down." The prisoners exchanged nervous glances. Being told to sit in the presence of officers was strange enough. Being told to do so by an enemy officer was bewildering. Once they were seated, the Red Cross representative stepped forward. He held up a small booklet with text in several languages, including Japanese. "This," he said, the interpreter translating his words, "is the Geneva Convention. It is an international agreement that protects prisoners of war. As signatories to this convention, the United States is required to treat you according to these rules." Captain Watanabe frowned. "Rules? For prisoners?" The Red Cross representative nodded. "Yes, under these rules, you have rights. You must be fed properly. You must receive medical care. You cannot be mistreated or tortured. You must be allowed to write letters home. You cannot be forced to provide military information beyond your name, rank, and serial number." A murmur spread through the gathered men. Rights? For prisoners? The concept was completely foreign to them. In the Imperial Japanese Army, prisoners had no rights. Surrender was the ultimate dishonor. Those who surrendered deserved whatever happened to them. That was what they had been taught. That was what they believed. Furthermore, the representative continued, "You will be paid for any work you do in this camp." This caused an even greater stir. Paid? Prisoners being paid? Lieutenant Takahashi raised his hand hesitantly, surprised when the American officer nodded for him to speak. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why follow these rules for enemies?" The American officer considered the question. "Because that's what civilized nations do," he answered. "War has rules. Without rules, we're just animals killing each other." That afternoon, each prisoner was issued 2 complete sets of clothes. Sturdy work clothes with PW stamped on the back, undergarments, socks, boots, and a jacket for cold weather. They received toiletry kits with soap, toothbrushes, toothpaste, razors, and combs. Some men held these simple items as if they were precious treasures, having gone without basic hygiene for months during combat. In their barracks that night, the men examined their new provisions with a mixture of suspicion and wonder. "My brother was captured in the Philippines," Private Matsuda said quietly, running his fingers over his new toothbrush. "He wrote one letter before he died. He said American prisoners fought each other for scraps of food, that guards made them beg like dogs for water." "Did you see the letter yourself?" asked Kenji. Matsuda hesitated. "No, my family was told about it by officials." "Officials who wanted us to fight to the death rather than surrender," Lieutenant Takahashi said, his voice barely above a whisper. The barrack fell silent. Such words bordered on treason. "The Americans must want something from us," Captain Watanabe insisted, breaking the tense silence. "Information, perhaps, or labor. This kindness. It must have a purpose." But not everyone was convinced anymore. The evidence of their own eyes was becoming harder to ignore. The daily meals, the medical care, the clean facilities, none of it matched what they'd been told to expect. Sergeant Toshiro sat on his bunk, reading through the Japanese translation of the Geneva Convention booklet they'd been given. "It says here we can practice our religion," he said with surprise, "that we can receive packages from home if mail service allows, that officers cannot be forced to work." "Do you believe any of that will actually happen?" Captain Watanabe challenged. Toshiro looked up. "It already is happening. Have you seen anyone being forced to work? Have you seen anyone beaten or starved?" The conflict was visible on every face. Men who had been raised to believe in the absolute truth of their leaders' words were confronting a reality that contradicted everything they'd been taught. Private Ichiro, who had been silent throughout the conversation, finally spoke. My father told me Americans would skin Japanese prisoners alive, that they would take photographs of the bodies to send to their families. He looked around at his fellow prisoners, all very much alive, all treated with basic dignity. He believed it. I believed it. Now I don't know what to believe. Have you ever had a moment where something you absolutely knew to be true suddenly fell apart? Where reality forced you to question your most basic beliefs? Comment below if you've experienced a moment that completely changed your perspective on something or someone. For these Japanese prisoners, learning they had rights, that international laws protected even enemies, wasn't just surprising. It was world-shattering. Everything they thought they knew about Americans, about war, about their place in the world, was being challenged not by propaganda, but by their own daily experience. And the biggest challenge to their beliefs was still to come, waiting for them in the camp's mess hall, where America's most powerful weapon was about to be deployed, food they had never imagined. 3 weeks after arriving at the camp, a change in routine was announced. The normal breakfast of oatmeal and toast would be replaced by what the Americans called a special meal. You see, their standard lunch fare. The Japanese prisoners lined up outside the mess hall at noon, the usual time for their midday meal. But today, something was different. A strange smell drifted through the air, rich, meaty, smoky, and completely unfamiliar to most of the men. "What is that smell?" Kenji asked, sniffing the air like a curious animal. Lieutenant Takahashi frowned. "Meat of some kind, but different." Inside the mess hall, the prisoners' eyes widened at the scene before them. Behind the serving counter, American cooks worked at large flat metal surfaces where meat sizzled and popped. One flipped round patties of ground beef with a spatula, pressing them down to release clouds of fragrant steam. Another dropped thin strips of potatoes into bubbling oil, filling the air with a golden aroma that made stomachs growl involuntarily. Most surprising of all was a large metal machine with the words Coca-Cola painted in bright red. A cook pressed a button and dark brown liquid filled a cup, bubbling and fizzing like some kind of magic potion. "What kind of food is this?" Captain Watanabe whispered, his usual confidence shaken by the unfamiliar scene. The prisoners moved forward in the line slowly, each watching the man ahead to see what would happen. They held their trays out nervously, still expecting some kind of trick or humiliation. "Here you go, fellas," a large American cook said cheerfully as he worked. Though they couldn't understand his words, his tone was casual, almost friendly, as if serving enemy prisoners was no different from serving his own countrymen. On each tray, he placed a round sandwich, a flat brown meat patty between two halves of a soft, light-colored bun. Next to it went a pile of golden brown sticks, fried potatoes still steaming from the oil. At the end of the line, each man received a coal bottle or paper cup filled with the dark, bubbling liquid. "Hamburger, fries, and a Coke," the cook announced to each prisoner, though few understood the words. "Enjoy." The portion stunned the Japanese soldiers. After years of war rations, small balls of rice, dried fish, sometimes nothing but barley soup for days, the amount of food on each tray seemed impossible. This much food for one meal? For one person? Private Ichiro stared at his tray in disbelief. "Is all this for me?" he asked the interpreter. When told yes, he shook his head. "There must be some mistake. This is enough for 3 days." The interpreter smiled. "Americans eat like this every day, sometimes more." The prisoners carried their trays to the tables, many still suspicious, examining the strange food from all angles before daring to touch it. Sergeant Toshiro picked up the hamburger with both hands, studying it carefully. The bread was soft, yielding under his fingers, nothing like the hard rice balls or dry bread they'd eaten during the war. The meat patty inside released a rich, fatty smell unlike anything in Japanese cuisine. Around him, other prisoners watched, waiting to see if he would risk taking a bite. "It could be poisoned," Captain Watanabe warned, even as he eyed his own hamburger with barely hidden hunger. Across the room, they could see American guards eating the exact same meal, laughing and talking as they bit into their hamburgers. One noticed the hesitation among the Japanese prisoners and nudged his buddy, nodding toward them. The American guard stood up, walked over to the prisoners' table, and did something unexpected. He picked up an untouched hamburger from Lieutenant Takahashi's tray, took a large bite, chewed, and swallowed. Then he placed it back down and gave a thumbs up before walking away. He ate from my food, Takahashi said in amazement. To show it's safe, Sergeant Toshiro took a deep breath and bit into his hamburger. His eyes widened instantly. The combination of flavors, the savory meat, the soft bread, the tang of condiments, hit his taste buds like an explosion. After years of near-starvation rations, the richness was almost overwhelming. It's good, he said, simply, looking dazed. Around the room, more prisoners began to eat, their expressions changing from suspicion to shock to something close to pleasure. Some struggled with the unfamiliar food, unsure how to hold the large sandwich or whether the paper wrapper should be removed from the straw for the Coca-Cola. Private Matsuda took a sip of the dark liquid and immediately pulled back, his eyes watering. "It bit my tongue," he exclaimed, staring at the bubbling drink. "It's the bubbles," explained a prisoner who had lived briefly in California before the war. "Americans like their drinks to bubble. It's called carbonation." The fries presented another mystery. Some men tried to eat them with chopsticks out of habit, dropping the slippery potato sticks. Others watched the Americans and copied them, picking up the fries with their fingers. An act that would have been considered improper in formal Japanese dining. In the corner of the mess hall, the American cooks watched the scene with mild curiosity. For them, this was just another lunch service, the food no different from what they themselves ate. They didn't realize they were witnessing a profound cultural collision, the first encounter between Japanese soldiers and iconic American food. "Look how skinny they are," one cook remarked to another. "No wonder they're wolfing it down." "Yeah, Japan must be running out of food to feed their troops like that," the other replied. Meanwhile, the prisoners were experiencing something beyond mere hunger satisfaction. The abundance itself was a shock, a testament to American resources that contradicted everything they'd been told about the enemy's supposed desperation in the war. Lieutenant Takahashi finished his hamburger and stared at his empty tray, his worldview visibly shaken. "In Tokyo," he said quietly, "I saw government posters showing Americans fighting over scraps of bread. They told us America was starving, that their supply lines were cut, that their people were rioting for food." He looked around at the casual abundance of the mess hall, the cooks tossing extra fries onto plates, the unlimited refills of Coca-Cola, the easy wastage as Americans threw away half-eaten food. "If they feed prisoners like this," he continued, "how must they feed their own families?" The implications hung heavy in the air. If American soldiers ate hamburgers and fries while Japanese soldiers survived on rice balls and occasional dried fish, if American prisoners received the same food as their guards while Japanese captives reportedly starved, what did that say about the two nations? About the war itself? Captain Watanabe, who had finally given in and eaten his meal, seemed troubled by similar thoughts. "This is why they'll lose the war," he declared, but with less conviction than usual. "They waste resources on luxuries, on prisoners who deserve nothing," but his words rang hollow in the face of what they were experiencing. The men around him were sitting straighter, their hollow cheeks already looking less sunken after just weeks of American meals. Some were even smiling as they experimented with dipping fries in ketchup, following the example of nearby American soldiers. For men raised in a culture where austerity was celebrated and suffering was honorable, the casual abundance of American food culture wasn't just surprising, it was revolutionary. It suggested a nation so confident, so resource-rich that it could afford generosity even toward enemies. And as they finished their first American lunch, a dangerous question formed in the minds of many prisoners. If this was how Americans treated their enemies, what else might they have been wrong about? The mess hall had fallen strangely quiet. 50 Japanese soldiers, men who had faced death in the skies over Pearl Harbor and the jungles of the Pacific, now sat frozen in their seats, defeated not by American bombs, but by American food. Private Ichiro held his half-eaten hamburger with trembling hands. The juices ran down his wrists, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes were fixed on nothing, seeing something far beyond the walls of the camp. "Ichiro-san, are you all right?" Kenji asked, touching his shoulder. Ichiro blinked, and to everyone's shock, tears spilled down his hollow cheeks. "My father," he whispered. "He was a fisherman. During the winter of 1941, before I joined the Navy, he couldn't catch enough fish to feed our family. My little sister's stomach would growl so loudly at night that none of us could sleep. His voice cracked. The government told us it was our duty to go hungry, to sacrifice for Japan's divine mission, that Americans were greedy monsters who feasted while the world starved. He looked down at his tray, the half-eaten burger, the pile of fries, the Coca-Cola still bubbling in its cup. If they feed their enemies like this, he said, his voice barely audible, what does that make us? At another table, Sergeant Toshiro was having a completely different reaction. He had just taken his first sip of Coca-Cola, and the explosion of sweetness, the strange burning bubbles, the cold unlike anything he'd tasted before, it all hit him at once. A sound escaped him that startled nearby prisoners. Laughter. Real, uncontrolled laughter. It's like drinking fireworks, he exclaimed, staring at the dark liquid in wonder. He took another sip and laughed again, the sound strange and rusty, as if his body had forgotten how. Lieutenant Takahashi watched this scene with growing unease. The food had affected him too. The rich beef patty, the soft bread, the salty crispness of the fries. It was overwhelming after years of military rations. But more disturbing than the taste was what it represented. It's a trick, Captain Watanabe insisted, pushing his tray away despite having eaten most of its contents. They're trying to make us soft, weak, to forget our loyalty. With food? Takahashi challenged quietly. Yes, with food, Watanabe hissed. Look around you. Men laughing, crying. Over what? Meat between bread? Have you forgotten your honor so quickly? Across from them, a former pilot named Hideki joined the conversation. In officer training, they showed us captured American rations, he said. Small tins of meat, hard crackers. They told us Americans were starving, that their soldiers fought over scraps. He gestured to the American guards eating casually nearby, refilling their Coca-Cola cups whenever they wanted, some leaving food unfinished on their trays. Does this look like starvation to you, Captain? Like scraps? Imagine tasting something for the first time that completely changes how you see your enemy. That's what was happening in this mess hall. Not just a new flavor, but a new reality. For soldiers raised on rice balls, barley, and occasional dried fish, the American meal was more than food. It was a window into a different world. In my last posting, Private Matsuda said quietly, "We got one rice ball per day, sometimes nothing. Our commander told us hunger made us stronger than Americans. That their weakness was their love of luxury." He lifted a French fry, examining its golden brown perfection. "I watched 3 men in my unit die of starvation at their posts," he continued. "They refused to leave their positions even as they grew too weak to stand. Our captain called it honorable sacrifice." The men around him fell silent, memories of similar scenes hanging heavy in the air. How can they make so much food? Kenji wondered, looking toward the kitchen where cooks were already preparing the next meal. I've never seen such abundance. An older prisoner, who had once worked as a merchant in Yokohama, leaned forward. "America has land," he explained. "Endless land for cattle, for wheat, for vegetables. They have machines to harvest fields that would take 1,000 Japanese farmers to tend. Their factories produce more in a day than ours do in a month." "Then why did our leaders say they were weak, that they would surrender quickly?" asked Ichiro, wiping away his tears. No one answered. The question was too dangerous, too close to thoughts none of them wanted to confront. At the end of the table, a prisoner who had been silent throughout the meal finally spoke. He was an older man named Tanaka, a former schoolteacher before the war. "When I was a boy," he said slowly, "my grandfather told me a story about a fox and a rabbit. The fox told all the animals that rabbits were vicious, bloodthirsty creatures who would eat their babies if given the chance. The animals believed the fox and they drove the rabbits from the forest. Only later did they discover the fox wanted the rabbit's burrows for himself." He looked around at his fellow prisoners. "Sometimes," he continued, "those who want us to hate others are hiding something from us." Captain Watanabe stood abruptly. "This is treasonous talk. Our emperor..." interrupted Lieutenant Takahashi gently, has never tasted a hamburger or seen how Americans treat their prisoners. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Around the mess hall, similar conversations were taking place as men tried to reconcile what they had been taught with what they were experiencing. Some, like Captain Watanabe, clung desperately to their training, seeing the food as a trick, a test of their loyalty. Others, like Ichiro and Takahashi, couldn't ignore the evidence before them, not just the food itself, but what it revealed about American society. For these men, raised in a culture where sacrifice and scarcity were virtues, where civilians were encouraged to eat less so soldiers could have more, the casual abundance of American food wasn't just surprising. It was world-view shattering. As the meal ended and prisoners began to clear their trays, an American guard approached with an interpreter. He held a box of chocolate bars. "We've got some extra dessert," the guard said through the interpreter, offering the box. "Anyone want seconds?" The simple question, the idea of extra food, of seconds, hung in the air like a revelation. In that moment, more clearly than any propaganda or military defeat could have shown them, the Japanese prisoners glimpsed the truth about which nation could outlast the other in this war. And for many, it tasted like a hamburger and Coca-Cola. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. With each passing day, the Japanese prisoners found their certainties crumbling a little more. The first hamburger had been a shock, but it was the steady rhythm of daily life that truly began to change them. The reliable meals, the medical care, the absence of the cruelty they had been promised. Most confusing of all was the ordinary decency with which they were treated. One morning, Lieutenant Takahashi was working in the camp garden when he dropped his shovel, accidentally striking an American guard's boot. In that moment, his body tensed instinctively. In the Imperial Army, such carelessness would earn at least a beating. He lowered his head, preparing for the blow. "No problem, man," the guard said casually, bending to pick up the shovel himself. He handed it back to Takahashi with a small smile. "Watch your grip. It's pretty hot today." The interpreter explained the guard's words, leaving Takahashi stunned. No punishment, no anger, not even irritation, just understanding. That night in the barracks, Takahashi described the incident to his bunkmates. "I don't understand these Americans," he confessed. "They have the power to hurt us, to punish us. Why don't they use it?" "Because they're soft," Captain Watanabe insisted, though his voice lacked its former conviction. "Their kindness is their weakness." But Private Ichiro, who had been quiet for days, looked up from the letter he was writing. "Is it weakness to have so much power and choose not to use it?" he asked. "Or is that a different kind of strength?" For men raised to believe that harshness was necessary for discipline, that suffering built character, that hierarchy must be enforced through fear, the American approach to authority was incomprehensible, and yet undeniably effective. The camp ran smoothly. Rules were followed. Work was completed, all without screaming officers or physical punishment. Twice a month, the prisoners were allowed to write letters home. These became windows into their changing minds. Kenji, the young pilot who had arrived, trembling with fear, sat on his bunk composing a letter to his mother. "Dear Mother, I am alive and well. The Americans feed us 3 meals every day. Real meat, vegetables, even sweets. My health is better than when I was flying. I have gained back the weight I lost. Yesterday, I had a fever. An American doctor gave me medicine. The same medicine they give their own soldiers. Please don't believe everything you hear about how prisoners are treated. I am safe. Your son, Kenji." He paused, pencil hovering over the paper, knowing such words might never make it past censors in Japan. The truth he was writing contradicted official government positions, yet he couldn't bring himself to lie. At another table, Sergeant Toshiro was having a heated discussion with several other prisoners. "My brother died, believing Americans would torture him if captured," he said bitterly. "He crashed his plane intentionally rather than surrender. He died for a lie." "It's not that simple," argued another prisoner. "Maybe Americans treat us well, but what about what they did to our cities? The bombings of Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe? Yes, and what about what we did to Nanking? Countered Toshiro, his voice dropping to a whisper. To Manila? To thousands of Chinese civilians? Shocked silence followed. Such topics were never discussed openly in Japan. The mere mention of Japanese war crimes was considered treasonous. Be careful, Toshiro, warned a friend. Such talk is dangerous, even here. That's just it, Toshiro replied. Here I can speak such thoughts and not fear punishment. Here I can question what I was taught. What does that tell you about the country we're fighting? The conflicts weren't just between prisoners, but within each man's heart. Many found themselves struggling with unexpected emotions. Gratitude toward their captors, doubt about their former certainties, even guilt for being treated well while their comrades still fought and died. Private Matsuda, whose infected leg wound had been treated by American doctors, confessed to the camp priest during a religious service. I feel ashamed when I receive kindness from Americans, as if I'm betraying Japan by not hating them. Is hate loyalty? The priest asked gently, or is truth loyalty? If you're fascinated by these moments when small human interactions change the course of history, hit subscribe now. Our channel explores the untold stories of how individual experiences, like tasting a hamburger or receiving unexpected kindness, sometimes did more to shape history than grand military strategies. Captain Watanabe, once the most hardline of the prisoners, found his certainties increasingly difficult to maintain. One afternoon, he watched as an American guard taught several Japanese prisoners how to play baseball, laughing alongside them, congratulating good hits, showing no hint of the racial hatred Japanese propaganda had promised. That night, he sat alone outside the barracks, staring at the stars. Lieutenant Takahashi found him there and sat quietly beside him. I was a history teacher before the war, Watanabe said finally, his voice soft. I taught my students that Western civilization was corrupt, weak, selfish, that Japan's divine mission was to rule Asia and show the world a better path. He looked down at his hands. I believed it completely. And now? Takahashi asked. Watanabe shook his head slowly. Now I don't know what to believe. If what they told us about Americans was wrong, what else was wrong? How can I return to Japan and face my students? This was the true struggle in the camp. Not against American guards or harsh conditions, but against the collapse of an entire worldview. Every decent meal, every fair interaction, every small kindness was another crack in the foundation of what they had been raised to believe. Some fought against this change, clinging desperately to their former certainties, finding ways to reinterpret American behavior as tricks or exceptions. Others surrendered to the new reality, allowing themselves to see their captors as human beings rather than demons. One evening, a group of prisoners was permitted to listen to the camp radio. News of Pacific battles came through, American victories, Japanese retreats. Some covered their ears, not wanting to hear of their nation's defeat. But Private Ichiro listened intently, his face troubled. Do you think, he asked quietly when the broadcast ended, that Japan's leaders were wrong about America's strength, or just as they were wrong about how Americans treat prisoners? The question hung in the air, dangerous and unavoidable. For these men, the journey from enemies to something else had begun not with grand ideological arguments, but with hamburgers and Coca-Cola, with the simple, undeniable evidence of their own experience. And for some, it was becoming increasingly difficult to hate the people who treated them with humanity they had never expected, or to fully believe in a cause built on what they now recognized as lies. By the 6th month in the American camp, the Japanese prisoners were nearly unrecognizable from the half-starved men who had arrived expecting torture and death. Private Ichiro, who had once been so thin his ribs could be counted through his shirt, now filled out his uniform. His hollow cheeks had rounded, and the constant hunger pains that had been his companion for years of military service were gone. He was not alone. Throughout the camp, the physical transformation of the prisoners was remarkable. When I came here, I could wrap my fingers around my upper arm and touch my thumb to my middle finger. Sergeant Toshiro commented during a medical checkup. Now I cannot even get my hand halfway around. The American doctor nodded as he recorded Toshiro's weight in his chart. You've gained 23 pounds since you arrived. Your blood tests show no more signs of malnutrition. In Japan, they would say I've become soft, Toshiro said with a small smile. Too much hamburger. The doctor laughed. There's nothing soft about being healthy, son. This simple exchange reflected a profound change. The Japanese military had glorified physical hardship, teaching soldiers that hunger was discipline, that suffering built character. American abundance challenged this core belief. Men who had once taken pride in their ability to endure deprivation now experienced the mental clarity, physical strength, and emotional stability that came with proper nutrition. The food itself had become a bridge between cultures. Sunday dinners often featured American classics that had once been strange but were now eagerly anticipated: fried chicken, meatloaf, apple pie. Some prisoners had even begun helping in the kitchens, learning to cook these foreign dishes, sometimes adding Japanese touches when ingredients allowed. My grandmother would be so ashamed, laughed Kenji as he flipped hamburgers on the grill under the supervision of an American cook. Cooking the enemy's food and enjoying it. But it wasn't just the food, it was everything the food represented. American industrial might, agricultural abundance, and a standard of living that most Japanese soldiers had been told was propaganda. Lieutenant Takahashi, who had once been one of the most decorated fighter pilots in his unit, spent hours talking with American guards about everyday life in the United States. He was particularly fascinated by stories of ordinary American families owning automobiles, having electric refrigerators, and eating meat several times a week. In Japan, only the wealthy had such things, he explained to a guard. We were told Americans were suffering, that your economy was failing, that your people rioted for food. Heck, we grow more food than we can eat, the guard replied. My family's farm in Iowa produced so much corn last year, we had to store it in our neighbor's silo too. These conversations happened throughout the camp, small moments of connection that had nothing to do with military strategy or political ideology, and everything to do with human lives and simple truths. For some prisoners, the psychological impact was profound. Captain Watanabe, once the most dedicated to Imperial Japan's cause, experienced a crisis of faith that left him deeply depressed. For weeks, he barely spoke, struggling to reconcile his lifetime of beliefs with what he now knew to be true. I led young men into battle, he confided to Lieutenant Takahashi one night. I told them Americans would torture them if captured, that it was better to die than surrender. His voice broke. How many died needlessly because of such lies? How many families lost sons who might have lived? Not every prisoner changed so dramatically. Some maintained that American treatment was an exception, that Japan's cause was still divine, that their loyalty to the emperor was unshaken. But even these men couldn't deny the contrast between what they had been told and what they had experienced. When the war finally ended in August 1945, the news reached the camp with both celebration and somber reflection. For the Japanese prisoners, it brought a new anxiety. They would be returning to a homeland devastated by war, to families who had been taught that surrender was shameful, to a society that might reject them for having been captured. But they would return changed in ways that would ultimately help rebuild the relationship between these former enemies. After repatriation to Japan, many former POWs became unofficial ambassadors of American culture. Private Ichiro, who had wept over his first hamburger, later opened one of Tokyo's first American-style diners in the 1950s. Lieutenant Takahashi became an English teacher, working closely with American occupation authorities to develop new educational materials that promoted international understanding rather than nationalism. Sergeant Toshiro, whose brother had died rather than face capture, wrote a memoir about his POW experience that challenged prevailing narratives about American barbarism. Though initially controversial, the book eventually helped many Japanese citizens understand that their former enemies were not the monsters they had been portrayed to be. These individual stories multiplied across Japan as thousands of former POWs returned home with similar experiences. While General MacArthur's occupation policies and massive economic aid helped rebuild Japan's infrastructure, it was these personal connections, these human stories of unexpected kindness, that helped rebuild trust between ordinary Japanese and American citizens. In a Tokyo University lecture in 1963, an elderly Professor Tanaka, the former schoolteacher who had been a prisoner in the American camp, summarized this impact to his students. Military might crush Japan's armies. Economic aid rebuilt our cities, but it was small human moments, the American guard who shared his cigarettes, the doctor who treated enemy wounds with care, the cook who served us the same food he himself ate. These moments rebuilt our humanity. He smiled at the young faces looking up at him, students born after the war with no personal memory of the conflict. Never forget this lesson. In war, it is easy to make people hate strangers, but it is very difficult to make people hate someone who has shared their food with them. When World War II ended, both America and Japan counted their dead, rebuilt their cities, and slowly healed their wounds. History books recorded the battles, the treaties, and the political changes that followed. But some of the most powerful moments of the war never made it into the history books. No military strategist ever planned to use hamburgers as a weapon. No general ever listed Coca-Cola as part of America's arsenal. No politician ever suggested that treating enemy prisoners with basic human dignity might accomplish what bombs could not. Yet in prison camps across America, something remarkable happened. Men who arrived expecting torture found kindness instead. Soldiers raised on stories of American brutality discovered something far more devastating than cruelty. They discovered that everything they had been taught about their enemy was wrong. And it began with food. A simple hamburger, meat on a bun, became an ambassador more effective than any diplomat. A bottle of Coca-Cola did more to change hearts than 1,000 propaganda leaflets. Meals shared between guards and prisoners created bridges across the deepest divides of war. Years later, when former Japanese prisoners were interviewed about what changed their perception of Americans, few mentioned grand political ideologies. They didn't talk about democracy versus imperialism. They spoke instead of small human moments. The guard who showed them pictures of his children, the doctor who treated their wounds with care, the cook who gave them seconds when they were still hungry. And most of all, they remembered the food. Not just its taste, but what it represented. A nation so confident in its resources that it could afford to be generous even to its enemies. A people secure enough in their humanity that they could see the humanity in others. The lesson is both simple and profound. When we recognize the basic needs and dignity of our enemies, when we see them as human beings rather than monsters, we create the possibility for real change. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who appreciates how small acts of humanity can change the world. Subscribe to hear more untold stories about how history was shaped not just by grand strategies and famous leaders, but by ordinary moments of connection between people who were supposed to hate each other. In our divided world today, perhaps the most radical act isn't winning arguments or defeating opponents. Perhaps it's simply this: seeing the humanity in those we've been taught to fear and offering them a place at our table. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't the one that destroys, it's the one that builds. One hamburger, one act of kindness, one moment of genuine human connection at a time.